Okay, I'm trying to be mindful of time differences. So I would like to start. Welcome, everyone. My name is Charusheela, and I would like to welcome you to the third of a four-part seminar series in honor of Dr. Drusilla Barker. This project is funded by the Harry Bridges Labor Center at the University of Washington and the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences at the University of Washington, Bothell. And it is a labor project that we began nearly two and a half years ago. Drew was part of it from the beginning, a sort of series of discussions about social reproduction and labor. And she was really looking forward to being part of this quarter's series. And so it was a real shock and a loss for us when she was no longer with us and wasn't able to participate. So given her role in creating this project, we have converted this in her honor. Today's speakers are Dr. Barbara Hopkins from Wright State University, and it was supposed to be Smriti Rao from Assumption College, but unfortunately, Smriti had a family emergency, social reproduction, so it goes. And so I will be speaking today in the seminar. But before we begin, I would really like to give a really warm welcome to Dr. LeeRay Costa and Dr. Darla Schumm. They are joining us from Hollins University. Hollins is where Drew taught for a fairly large portion of her career before she moved to the University of South Carolina. And I'm just really delighted to have colleagues from there join us. After we finish today's talk, we will be joined at the end by Serap Kayatekin, who is the president of the Association for Economic and Social Analysis, which is another group with which Drew had a very close relation. But without further ado, LeeRay and Darla.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I want to thank Dr. Charusheela for organizing this memorial series in honor of my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Drusilla Barker, and for inviting me to share some of my memories of her. And if I get choked up, I hope that you will forgive me. So Drew hired me in my first job right out of graduate school as an assistant professor of gender and women's studies and anthropology at Hollins University. And this is a small, historically women's college in Roanoke, Virginia. In fact, she wooed me to come to Hollins with the invitation to build this new gender and women's studies program together with her. I really admired her vision and her program building skills, which included skillfully negotiating administrative barriers and outright faculty hostility towards feminism and suspicion of the fields of gender and women's studies and feminist economics. But if you knew Drew, then you know that these obstacles only fueled her fire and her commitment. So despite being at this really tiny institution in rural Southwest Virginia and being the only feminist economist for miles around, Drew had a big research agenda that has since had a significant impact on the field. Her research was taking off at the same time that we were building this new program. And during those years, Drew wrote 2 books with Edith Kuiper, Towards a Feminist Philosophy of Economics and Feminist Economics in the World Bank. She also completed Liberating Economics, Feminist Perspectives on Family, Work, and Globalization, which she co-authored with her colleagues Suzanne Bergeron and Susan Feiner. These books, together with many of her other essays and articles, have made critical interventions into how we think about political economy, gender and globalization, radical politics, and communities of care. But when I think about Drew, I think about her incisive intellect and her deep curiosity about the world, her commitment to feminism and to social justice, her clever wit, and her generosity of spirit. We worked together at Hollins for 6 wonderful years, and she was an incredible mentor to me and to so many other junior faculty. She was already a real active member of the National Women's Studies Association when I arrived at Hollins, and she insisted that I attend the Program Administration and Development Pre-Conference with her, preparing me to co-lead the department and eventually take over when she departed for her new position as chair of women's studies at the University of South Carolina. Drew was an inspiring and effective leader who never asked anyone to engage in labor that she herself wasn't willing to engage in. And in that sense, she was a wonderful collaborator who thrived in collective work. She served on many curricular and governance committees at Hollins and was a member of numerous feminist and economic academic associations. Whenever she'd come back from the many conferences she attended each year, and IAFE being one of her most favorites, she was always bursting with joy and energized by the young scholars and new ideas that she'd encountered. I've heard so many colleagues share upon her passing that she was always a kind and yet firm interlocutor, that she always expressed interest in people's work across a variety of disciplines, and that she took their ideas really seriously. And as robust as Drew's scholarly life was, she also had a very full personal life where she always made space and time for friends, for pleasure, and for fun. Contra dancing, traveling, dining out, drinking wine, and especially attending the opera were some of her favorite activities. And she loved to host parties at her house for friends and colleagues and students. Students absolutely adored her. And so many of them have reached out to me to share their fond memories in this time of her passing. And this has been one of the most beautiful aspects of this otherwise challenging time of grief. Drew modeled brilliantly how to live a life of the mind infused with community and connection. She was, and she will remain, a bright and beloved light to so many of us. And I'm so grateful to have known her and to have loved her.
Good evening. I too want to echo my thanks for being invited to speak about a beloved colleague and friend, Drew Barker. As LeeRay has so beautifully just expressed, Drew was an exceptional feminist scholar, but she was also an exceptional feminist role model and friend. And it's the latter that I'm going to spend a few minutes reflecting on this evening. LeeRay and I actually arrived at Hollins pretty much on the very same day. We were hired at the same time and began teaching in the same year. But I was hired into the religious studies department, which is my field. I arrived at Hollins into a department with several junior colleagues, none of whom stepped into the role of mentor for me. And if Facebook is any indication, after Drew's death, one of the themes that popped up over and over again was how Drew had mentored so many junior colleagues and students. And this was my experience when I arrived at Hollins. Drew and I were in very different fields. I was and continue to be an affiliated faculty for gender and women's studies. So we certainly encountered each other in that space. But there was no reason for Drew to take any particular interest in me or in my scholarship or work, especially because she was very busy with LeeRay, mentoring LeeRay. But because of who she was, because of her commitment to colleagues, especially junior colleagues. And I believe because of her commitment to her feminist principles, she took me under her wing as well. Drew guided me through the early, very difficult years of teaching. She guided me through the anxiety-ridden and stressful tenure process. And she also invited me to co-author an article for her entitled Feminist Ethics for the Elgar Handbook on Economics and Ethics. And this was really a gift that she gave to me. She not only helped me add one more publication to my CV in my march towards tenure, but it was really an opportunity for me to learn from her about what it meant to be a collaborator. Again, another one of the feminist commitments that Drew exhibited throughout her scholarship and other forms of work. Another thing that I learned from Drew, and that many of us at Hollins learned from Drew, was how to speak truth to power. There were many faculty meetings where some of LeeRay's and my colleagues droned on about what we considered insignificant things. When Drew would stand up and with her wit, she would, in a sentence or two, deconstruct everything that someone else had been saying for the last 10 or 15 minutes. But she did it most of the time with kindness, which was another characteristic that came through in Drew over and over again. I learned from her when she was the chair of our faculty how to be a strong, decisive, but compassionate leader. Drew was not a pushover. You could not get her to do anything that she didn't want to do or that she did not think was the right thing to do. And I am forever grateful to her for the lessons she taught me in leadership. Many, many years, even probably decades later, I also was the chair of the faculty, and I always had Drew's voice in the back of my mind as I embarked on that role. As I've been reflecting on what I wanted to say about Drew tonight, a folk song written by Sam Baker kept popping into my head. And I just want to recite one verse from that song because it is, in part, my send-off to Drew, but also because the words in this verse are characteristics that Drew embodied throughout her life. And I quote, "Go in peace, go in kindness, go in love, go in grace." Peace, kindness, love, and grace are just a few of the words that describe Drew Barker. I am grateful to have learned from, been mentored by, and worked with Drew. But most importantly, I am so grateful to have been able to call her a beloved friend. Thank you.
Thank you, LeeRay and Darla. I need a minute. This is such a touching memorial. Thank you, both of you. This memorial is also fitting because in this series, today's seminar was the one that Drew was supposed to be part of. So in terms of the lineup that we had organized, today's seminar was supposed to have Drew as part of it. And the theme for today's seminar is about what it really means to take gender seriously in economics, and to sort of think through what a sort of feminist economics looks like. And, as has been mentioned repeatedly, this sort of deeper commitment to gender and to feminism as really scholarly, substantive, analytic categories, as well as sort of not just a category of analysis, but a vision of what her own career was, but also what she thought our profession should be, is a theme that's running through all the work we do. And so I would like to invite my colleague, Dr. Barbara Hopkins, to give the first seminar, the first talk for today's seminar. Dr. Hopkins, a professor of economics at Wright State University. She's a feminist radical institutionalist economist, a member of the Feminist Radical Political Economy Collective. She has done a tremendous amount of publishing. She has been very active in institutionalist economics. But more than that, I also really want to note that Barbara convened the very first meeting of what eventually joined with some other colleagues to become Feminist Radical Political Economy. She actually convened the first effort to have a thematic group on feminist philosophy and epistemology inside IAFE. This was quite a while ago, but I remember that very clearly, the sort of insistence that we need a collective discussion so that gender doesn't just become one variable in an econometric set. The one is not against econometrics, but that there must be something more substantive, social, institutional about it. So without further ado, Barbara.
Oh, thank you, Charo. And I feel since I know that Drew was supposed to be here, I feel a greater burden than I normally would. I want to start with, I actually have some slides that I'm going to try and share here. Does that work? Okay. Okay, here we go. So I wanted to do this as thinking about what gender is, to start with that, and do sort of something. It feels very simple, but like everything in feminist radical political economy, it gets complicated very quickly. And just think about the idea of what gender is as structure. And before I get to that, I want to talk a little bit of the foundation of this. And part of this is because as we have been remembering Drew and thinking about her influence on this, and really every single member, which is to say all of the fine scholars that are talking in this seminar, the members of the Feminist Radical Political Economy Collective, every single one of them has at one point or another said things to me that very much changed the way I thought about things. And so the point that was made in the remembrances from Hollins, that Drew recognized that the formation of knowledge is collective, is very much part of our experience. But one of the things that I wanted to bring up that I think was that forms a foundation of the way Drew thought about things is that she was focused on what I have framed here as an inclusive epistemology. And what that means is that you need to be listening to the experiences that are different than your own and listening to the experiences of many, of all the voices that you come across. And especially also trying to connect with voices that are far from your own socioeconomic location. And what that means when you start having an inclusive epistemology is that you need to deal with difference. And as that applies to the kind of things that I do, one of the things that means is that there's many different variations of capitalisms. We're not talking about, when we analyze the challenges and problems associated with capitalism as a structure, it's actually many different structures. It's different at different moments in time, and it's different across countries. And as Suzanne Bergeron, as her research illustrates, those differences can actually exist within countries as well, of those structures. The other sort of lesson associated with this is that people are subject to different rules and different punishments for breaking the same rules. And that's foundational for the way that I want to talk about what structure is. And that's foundational also for understanding what gender is, because gender in the way that I'm framing it is about different rules for men and women. The other point that I want to make for the foundation of this analysis is that structure, the whole point of structure matters a lot. And I have to interact more often perhaps than those of you that might be in a women's studies program with libertarians. And so I want to emphasize that there's no such thing as no structure. There are different structures. There are more liberatory and more oppressive structures, but there's no such thing as no structure. And the other point that I want to make that's foundational, and I think this is foundational in Drew's work, this is foundational for the whole feminist radical political economy collective, is that the goal of inquiry is to identify, and is to identify an analysis, but for the specific thing that I'm doing right here, it's identifying the rules that facilitate provisioning with dignity. That is about, provisioning is about, social provisioning is about providing for people's needs and wants. And the idea of doing it with dignity emphasizes a notion of respect for all of these many different experiences. And there is implied in that, I think, addressing questions of social justice. So this is my model for what thinking about structure is in framing it as an idea of rules. And I want to emphasize that that idea of rules here is meant to be much broader than it is often in economic writing. There is a focus in a lot of comparative systems of rules that are laws and procedures. All of heterodox economics builds on the idea that there is historical experience that shapes the kinds of choices that we have. But I want to focus on this idea of the informal customs and the ideology and beliefs. And in the article that I had asked my students and Charu's students to read, that comes from Drew, she spent a lot of time explaining the cult of domesticity and the ideology behind the whole idea of a male breadwinner family structure. and she emphasizes that as ideology. I want to sort of argue that some of that, you can frame that as you can frame the idea of the male breadwinner as a informal custom that has evolved as part of the Industrial Revolution. Institutional economists talk about that as the second public-private split between family and the economy. And that in this structure, sort of in this model of structure that I have, is to emphasize the way in which these informal customs and ideology and beliefs that we have, beliefs about women's proper role, both in the family and in workplaces, ideas about what work should look like, ideas about who should do what kinds of work, all of those kinds of things shape the kinds of choices that we have. So the decisions that we make about economic processes, the decisions to produce, to consume, to invest, to transfer goods, and so on, and don't get caught up in thinking that's just about markets, because a lot of goods are produced for your own consumption, especially goods produced in households. These things also affect the habitual behaviors that people who've studied institutional economics will recognize as the habits of thought. And those things all, that creates essentially the kind of structural constraints that mean that different people located differently have different kinds of choices available to them. But it's also important to recognize that even the formal laws and procedures can have differential effects. And in the article I shared, some of the examples of that, say, is how ownership plays out. Access to credit. Historically, women did not have access to credit. Women's property became men's property upon marriage. This became a fundamental problem in a variety of different cultures where husbands would sell off the family property, leaving women and their children with nowhere to live. And so these kinds of structure, sort of laws also that limited the kinds of work that women could do and so on, are important ways that the legal structure has limited the choices that women have. But the part of the point of thinking about this and expanding that notion of rules is to emphasize the ways in which the informal customs and the ideology, the gender division of labor, for example, the cult of domesticity that Drew went into great detail about, and the ideal of the male breadwinner. And part of that ideal of the male breadwinner is not just the idea that the husband goes off to work and the wife stays home and takes care of the kids, is that the expectations of how work plays out, how work is organized, take some of those assumptions. There was an interesting study done that appeared in the Harvard Business Review about a company. Almost all the people in this company were men, but the people at the top, the men at the top in the CEO positions, were in marriages where their wives did not work and they were responsible for the household. And that left men time to work much longer hours because all of their basic needs were taken care of by somebody else. And then the people below them were mostly in more egalitarian relationships where their wives had careers of their own. There were more expectations from them about what they were expected to do. And there was a conflict between what their bosses expected of them in this context and what they wanted out of life because of the different kinds of relationships that they were in terms of trying to challenge this male breadwinner ideology. And part of that idea of emphasizing the informal customs and the ideology and beliefs is that it's easier to change the laws. You just pass different laws. And it's much harder to unseat some of these unconscious biases that people have and these notions about what the ideal sets of behaviors and what other people in the society expect of you. Now, the other piece about this is rules don't mean anything in the absence of enforcement. And one of the things that's important to understand is that just because there's a rule doesn't mean people follow it. So, you know, that we're more familiar with the implications of legal punishments for transgressions. But for those kinds of informal rules and violations of cultural beliefs, there's still a major mechanism of enforcement, and primarily that's about social exclusion, about not participating with that individual, of leaving them out in the cold in many ways. And especially as you start having women raising children, that social exclusion can be even more costly in terms of their ability to take care of those children. And so it ends up being a strong enforcement towards following those social norms. This picture that I have at the bottom, though, sometimes that penalty might be worth it. This picture at the bottom is a woman in jail for violating, for civil disobedience as part of the movement for the right for women to vote in the early part of the 20th century. Now, there's another thing I want to say about rules, which is that sometimes rules have an unintended differential impact. And the example I have here is a lot of this has been corrected, but it's been common for health insurance, for example, to more strongly subsidize Viagra and not so much birth control pills. And what that means, this is just an example of this kind of unintended differential impact. But what that means is that that the society as a whole is subsidizing the sex lives of older men and not so much the sex lives of younger women. And what are the implications of that in terms of the kinds of choices that people have available to them, and the value that we place on it? And that leads to the next point that I want to make, which is this idea of how we as a society value various different things is also part of that idea of choices that we have available to this. And so you can think about valuation as being, it's sort of how does the society place value, define value and understand value, place value on different things. And a capitalist economy emphasizes this idea of exchange value. And one of the things that exchange value does is it says that caring and unpaid labor is specifically not valued. Why are the people that take care of your children paid so much less than the people that take care of your money? And this is about the way in which exchange value forms a significant part of the structure of our society. But one of the things that this means also for feminists is that it's not merely that women are undervalued, but the kinds of things that femininity is supposed to value is undervalued, right? And so this is also part of the challenge, that it's not enough for women to just go enter the labor force and so on. There needs that. This is partly about getting at questions of how we think about value. And of course, the Marxist theory emphasizes the idea of labor theory of value, but that of course requires that we recognize the work that women do in the home and the caring labor as labor. And institutionalists talk about instrumental value, and I like to sort of think about the idea of instrumental value as this is about people, not profits. So exchange value is primarily about profits. Instrumental value is value of that which furthers the life force versus profit. Interestingly enough, by the way, I was looking for images and I found this book, which I have not read, but I'm now interested in doing so. So what does it mean then to talk about gender as structure? So you can think about those aspects of laws, procedures, informal customs, belief, etc. This is what I'm thinking about as gender as structure, that represent different rules and options for men and women. And I say men and women, you know, one of the critiques when those frames, when that phrasing appears in a journal article is, wait a minute, you're ignoring that there are additional gender options. But in terms of the ideology, in terms of the ideological structure that we have there, and of course there are efforts among the right to legislate this idea that there are these two. And there's nothing about the idea of these rules as being inherently natural or being an aspect of biology. The point of talking about gender as a set of rules is all of these rules are socially constructed. All of these rules are things that human beings have created. And so, as I said, the example that was laid out very carefully by Drew and her co-authors, Suzanne Bergeron and Susan Feiner, is the cult of domesticity. And interestingly enough, the cult of domesticity is really a 19th century ideological construct. It comes out early on in the development of industrialization in the United States and also to some degree in Britain. But it's actually gotten a revival recently as part of sort of backlash against the feminist movement. But this idea of the cult of domesticity is the ideology about gender and women's proper place in the home. And as I said, it's also an ideology about how work is supposed to be. Men are supposed to work for money, women are supposed to work in the home, unpaid, for love, and so on. And women are responsible for housework and care work as part of that. And part of what this does in creating structures, it limits the women's opportunity to make a living. And that limits women's opportunities also to have more bargaining power in their relationships, and to have options other than being in a relationship. And work then on the flip side is supposed to be all consuming and leave little space for family responsibilities. And all of those pieces are highly problematic. In addition to that, this is also problematic because it leaves out so many people. And it also, at no point has that ideal of the male breadwinner household really been the dominant. It's been the ideal, but it's never been the dominant family form, because there have always been a lot of families that needed two incomes and needed to find ways to earn more income. Now, how does this idea then of difference play out? In the article that I included, I was focusing primarily on different forms of capitalism, different countries, the way in which you get differences across different countries that create different opportunities, different choices available for women and men to make different choices in terms of their interaction with the economic processes that are part of the society. And one of the examples that I used is this idea of property rights and who owns the family home, and the choices that you have, and that also is significant in terms of questions about bargaining power. And what are the options, say then, that, for example, a woman who is in an abusive relationship, her ability to get out of that, and what kinds of assets she can leave with. Another big difference is state provision of childcare. How easy is it to cover the expenses of caring for children if you go to work? And various different welfare states have put different amounts of money into that, and different structures for protecting the quality of that child care and so on. Work protections that are gender specific. One of the things that has been a significant part of the Dutch system, for example, is to increase the availability of part-time work so that women with children can have jobs that are less encompassing, and protections for that kind of work to have the same kinds of quality and conditions of work, and have the same pay rates and so on. Traditionally, part-time work is paid less than full-time working. Our industry here in terms of higher education, look at the pay of part-time workers versus full-time workers, significant. And so legislation linked to that. When I do country differences, you'll see that most of this is actually focused on legislation, because anything else, all the informal customs are likely to be defined in smaller locations of communities rather than necessarily countrywide. Borders are not always drawn around sort of logical boundaries. And then the other piece that I wanted to include here is the taxes and the unemployment insurance. In Britain, for example, unemployment insurance was paid out only based on your total family income. And what that meant was that the wives of unemployed men were actually better off not working because their whole paycheck would be taken away in terms of having their husband no longer receive his unemployment insurance. So that undermines women's, again, the sort of kinds of choices that women might make to enter the labor market don't make financial sense because of biases in the structure of the laws that are written. And I'm basically over time here of what I was supposed to do, but I did want to emphasize here that you also get significant class and race differences, and this is also an oversimplification. The women, race, and class dates back to the 1960s feminist movement, where we emphasized all of those categories. And really, there are many more categories. There's age, sexual preference, national origin, ethnicity, etc. So you can imagine all those being added in here. But sort of one of the points that Drew and her co-authors make in the article about the cult of domesticity is the cult of domesticity was never meant to apply to women of color. There is a significant difference in terms of relative representation of domestic work, which is not very high quality work in terms of pay, job security, working conditions, etc. And so those differences need to be considered in terms of the sorts of choices and options that people face. And working conditions, access to benefits, and remote work. This came up significantly in terms of the COVID pandemic, where, again, women of color had less access to work during the pandemic that was safe and protected and so on. And so what is the sort of takeaway from this is, one, that the ideology about gender is what creates a lot of the differential choices and the differential punishments for violating norms. And these different rules manifest as the stratification based on gender. So that you can think about that structure as being built around the various ideologies, the cult of domesticity being one significant example of that. So I'll end there and pass it to Charu.
Thank you, Barbara. I guess I introduce myself. I'm Charu. I'm Professor Charusheela. And I have found over time that when I try and use PowerPoints in Zooms, I get so obsessed and focused with shifting my slides. I forget to look at the camera. I forget to speak properly. I've never really mastered that art. So I'm going to just speak to you. When we edit this, I want to actually, before we go any further, give a very special shout out to some folks. Sophie, who has been managing this, and you have most of you all been in contact with. Atlanta, Duncan, who's been behind the scenes, really helping to manage things. So Sophie and Atlanta, without the two of them, this seminar couldn't have happened. I also want to mention a couple of people. One is Melissa Lopez. She is going to be, and she's already begun the work of editing these videos. So when the editing happens, she will also add some cues and texts to help people follow things along, including when you have situations like mine, when I have no PowerPoint. And an additional special thanks to Tenmoy Saroja, who has been acting as a web manager, independent consultant, and someone who's been supporting us to find out how to do things under Creative Commons and copyleft, so we can share things with the public while acknowledging and ensuring that we respect the scholarly work of our speakers. So with that said, I'm Charu. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. The response to this particular seminar has been both overwhelming and unsurprising. And my aim today is to pick up on themes raised by Barbara and move them not further, but in an additional direction. So to begin with, I'm going to start with a very crucial item having to do not with gender, which I'm going to come back to, but with Barbara's point about how what we want to look at is provisioning. That when we think of care and we think of social reproduction, we look at provisioning. How do you provision for people in a community? And so I really want to start there because I think it's really important, especially for the students here and also for our guests, to remember that the tradition Drew worked in was social reproduction. It's the tradition we all work in. Social reproduction is not limited to or narrowly the same thing as childcare. It includes it, and childcare is a key element of it, but I'm going to speak a little bit more about why it's a problem to think of it only in that way. And social reproduction really is all of the work that goes into reproducing, not merely biologically, but socially and culturally, a social structure. That's why it's social reproduction. So you're talking about childcare, but you're also talking about healthcare, as we've seen before. You're also talking about women who are working in peace accords, in post-conflict resolution, in conflict zones. And so you're really talking about as well, not just the labor done by unpaid labor done by women and others, and I'll come to the others in a minute, but you're also talking about all the various mechanisms by which social reproduction could happen. So the second thing I want to really focus on is Barbara's points about rules. That rules are things that you follow or don't follow, and then you get sanctioned or not sanctioned for following them or not. And I want to suggest that one of the most interesting elements of gender is not the rules that sanction women who fail to engage in social reproduction. It's the rules that reward powerful people for failing to engage in social reproduction. That is the idea that the sanction is about those who don't follow the rules, but there's a sort of failure to look at power being the right to not follow rules is very crucial. And so I'm going to come back to that one as well, because I think that when it comes to questions of tax structures, social reproduction, and the issue of how we actually engage in provisioning for our society as a whole, while there is a sort of focus on what women do, I think there is not enough focus on what elite men, people in power, fail to do. So that is going to be a thread in what I'm going to do. But with those links, what I would like to begin with is a very specific article that Drew wrote for Rethinking Marxism. In fact, we're looking forward to Serap Kayatekin, president of the Association for Economic and Social Analysis, conclude our discussion at the end of today with additional memories of Drew. But Drew was very active in ASA, Association for Economic and Social Analysis, and ASA puts out the journal Rethinking Marxism, and she wrote a really lovely article. I think my students would have rebelled if we kept on adding articles, and Drew was a prolific writer. So of course we had to limit ourselves in what we would force people to read. But the article I have in mind is a really wonderful one, which is called Querying the Paradox of Caring Labor. And that word querying was really to ask a question, and it was also a play on queering. So that article looked at the movie Paper Dolls, which is a video, a movie, a documentary in Israel, which tracks how, as a result of the Intifada, the cheap labor that used to provide sort of care work at very low wages started drying up because borders started shutting down. And so what happened is you had an influx of Filipino migrant workers, Philippines, of course, being the world's largest labor exporter in terms of post-debt crisis and debt crisis times. And most of the people who were tracked here were queer and trans. So you have this very interesting situation of migrant Filipino queer trans workers doing elder care for conservative Jewish older folks whose own families were busy having jobs and didn't have the time to do that. At a time when Israel was representing itself as really at the cutting edge of LGBTQ and trans rights in the Middle East. The rest of the Middle East and Muslim communities were not really so good on gender rights. And these folks were essentially being denied human rights on the grounds of their migration status. So one of the questions that Drew is asking is about intersectionality. What are the ways in which you can determine that it's quite okay to treat these people who are primary care providers poorly, and that's not actually discrimination because you're not doing it because of their gender. No, you're doing it because they're migrants or for some other reason. And so this question about what legitimizes or delegitimizes whether people have rights, I think is at the center both of querying the paradox of caring labor and I think intersectionality, which carries forward the idea of how we use intersectionality in relation to gender. So one way to think of intersectionality is race, class, and gender. These are disaggregable, additive, and can somehow just be put together as I can decide how much of your problem is due to A, how much of your problem is due to B, how much of your problem is due to C. And indeed, that is what the Israeli state was doing. That is, oh, you know, I can say that these problems have nothing at all to do with gender because we're so progressive. It's only because they're migrants. So we're fine. And indeed, folks have pointed out to the question of pinkwashing. And indeed, the role of these progressivist ideas of gender, care, and LGBTQ rights is something that another is a member, Rethinking Marxism scholar, Ezra Erdem, in her article along with Jin Haritawarn faced. This was not an RM article, but it was an article that was pulled because they critiqued Peter Tatchell, who argued that the way to protect rights in the West was to not allow problematic non-Western ideas from Muslims to come in. And he felt a bit embarrassed, I think, when it was pointed out that until about a couple of years before these claims, in fact, you did not have LGBTQ rights in much of the West either. So the socio-historical context of claims about rights, I think, are as important as diverse capitalisms. Related to that is the importance of diverse transitions. I will now come to a second element of this work having to do with gender norms and structure, which has to do with the work that the students did read, which is the ways in which you had a cult of domesticity. There is a historicity to the emergence of particular family forms, the male breadwinner, but implicit in the male breadwinner is also the nuclear family form, as opposed to a multi-generational form. So the article that the students, that we would have had a chance to discuss, unfortunately, I can't go into it in depth because Smriti is not here, and if you ask questions about it, I would much rather have her answer them. But the Rao Naidu article looks at time use data from India to talk about the work that women do, the unpaid labor that women do. And one of the very interesting things is, even though at this point you're not even addressing additional differences around sexuality and non-normative gender forms, you still see a lot of difficulty in simply transposing a pre-given theory of households onto the data, because the kind of work and the kinds of households, labor and non-household labor, by which I mean around the house, but would not normally be classified as domestic or care labor in industrial Western urban context. But if you're thinking about large majority of the world, where people are working in agriculture, you're talking about foraging, you're talking about maintenance of cows, you're talking about weeding, you're talking about various forms of agrarian labor, both paid and unpaid. You get a very different picture of how this works. And it's very tempting to view this as some kind of pre-capitalist cultural remnant. But one of the things that has become very clear as we look at the history and the data is that this is not pre-capitalist at all, in the sense that what you are seeing really is capitalist agriculture using female-heavy wage labor interspersed with other forms. And I'm glad to see that Anjan Chakrabarti is in the room. He and Anubhar have actually done a tremendous amount of work on also looking at how do you actually classify different forms of production when they don't fit neatly into these transitional categories. And many of them are really emergent rather than throwbacks. So with that in mind, difference then emerges as fairly complicated. First, gender itself as a difference is fairly diverse. There isn't a single global gender in terms of how it operates, even though we might use words like women and men and so on to make it feel as if it's all the same. But then we know it's not, because we say things like, well, yeah, but you know, where I grew up, this is what women's roles were like. And so that immediately tells you, you also already know it's non-universal. So what you're beginning to see is that is different. The historical context is different. And finally, I want to add questions of intersectionality. And in terms of the question of intersectionality, what becomes really crucial and important is the way in which different groups of people enter the social ambit and relations of production. This is a very particularly difficult knot for feminists to untangle. So I'm going to actually go back to a little bit of some theoretical questions that I think we have to answer, and then I will give some concrete examples. Usually when we talk of intersectionality, we talk of race, class, gender, and so on. I want to focus on class for a minute. While there is more attention to race in intersectionality for very obvious reasons, having to do with the historical role of Black feminists in creating that concept, and I'm going to come back to that. I want to look at class for a minute. It's very interesting, going back to Heidi Hopkins' early work. How do you think of class? When we talk about the intersection of class and gender, there's 2-3 ways to do it. It's not actually obvious what way you do it. You can talk of women as a class. That is, that if class is about occupying a very particular location in an economic structure, then those folks who engage in unpaid labor in the home and engage in social reproduction have a very particular location in the economic structure. They do very particular kinds of work. And their reward for it very often takes a very specific forms. Often it actually takes the forms of poor or inadequate reward, right? So this is the classic idea of, as Barbara pointed out, the Marxist idea of labor theory of value, that labor centers the concept of class and value. So one way to think about this is women as a class. We are a class that perform unpaid domestic labor, which benefits society. It is a class whose social position is anchored with ideologies of patriarchy, of gender norms, ideas of reciprocity, care, and love, just as other kinds of labor systems have their own forms of how that labor is secured. In a slave system, there is a direct ownership. In a racial slave system, there is a direct ownership in the body of the worker. There is a direct imagination of the right of the owner to the products of that labor. There is a legal and there is an ideological structure that upholds this. This is true for unpaid labor. The legal structure of marriage and divorce, alimony, healthcare. There is a sort of cultural structure of gender norms, a whole bunch of things that arrange that. If you are in a capitalist system, you're doing wage labor. There is the idea that you will get paid wages for your labor. There is an ideology that markets are fair, that markets are equal, that they operate very particularly as a level playing field. So every labor system has something. And so we can talk about women as a class. And indeed, there's a tremendous amount of feminist work, especially in the domestic labor debates about this. Another way to talk about intersection of race, class, and gender is to talk about working class women. Now, this is very interesting, because working class women as a category is not necessarily or automatically linked to the particular labor arrangements that the women themselves are engaged in. That category is a category that associates a woman's status to the status of her family. So to the extent that Marxism itself very often thought of working class women in those terms, it was both right and wrong. It was right because very, very clearly, the socioeconomic status of your family has tremendous amount of implications on the types of gender norms that are available in the community you grow up in, the types of gender norms that are sustainable in the community you grow up in, because depending on sort of whether you're working class or not, then that's going to tell you whether you can afford to live in a one-income household or whether you actually need two incomes, how you handle social reproduction, what your access to that is, and so on. But the sort of difficulty we face here is that we've always had a lot to unpack when it comes to difference. When it comes to difference, we use shorthands, race, class, gender, and we think that we can just apply it. But as Barbara has pointed out, if difference is an institutional historical product, you can't do it that way. You need a much more concrete and anchored theory of difference as a product of structure, which is very different than the idea of difference as some kind of individual internal property that you call your personal identity. So to the extent that you think of difference and race, class, gender as identity, to that extent you're thinking of it as the property of the individual. But to the extent that you see this as a structural form, what happens when you come to economics, and particularly when you come to the kind of concepts of gender that Drew was really pushing forward, was that you start seeing it as a social historical product. And because it is produced, it doesn't mean it is irrelevant. It doesn't mean anything goes. Because it's a construct, it doesn't mean it's only a construct. Because constructs can be quite powerful things. It simply means that that makes it available for you to reconsider as a political act that you consider and you reconstitute. So this then is where epistemology, and particularly Drew's work with femmes, feminist epistemology, methodology and science studies, become so important. Because the reason to listen to diverse voices was not merely a kind of liberal James Mill, diverse voice question, but it was that you cannot really think identity politics purely on personal experience, because that is a data set of one. And because power shapes the way you look at things, you can't purely depend on your experience, because your experience and the way you interpret it is going to depend on your own lenses of power. So for Drew, epistemology was not just learning about difference from other people, it was reflexive. It was learning to look at your own experience through other lenses. And for Drew, this was a really crucial element of how you thought about the epistemological element of feminist economics, that you used it not only to look at people who were different from you, you used it to look at how your experience might look different if viewed at from a different lens. And so with that kind of view in mind, I want to note that when I wrote Empowering Work, Edith and Drew both very kindly invited me. It's published in Toward a Feminist Philosophy of Economics. At that point, bargaining was really emerging as something we could use that could help us look at power inside feminist economics. And it was very hard to critique it. But at the same time, both Drew and Edith felt that if you took difference seriously and the epistemology of difference seriously, you really needed to think of what bargaining looked like. If you had people with very different kind of relationships to the labor market, given that bargaining models really focused on labor market entry and wages as a way to empower women. And so in many ways, that article was a real sort of shaped by Drew's effort to say, well, let's look at what this experience looks like if we look at it from some other angle. So with that idea of difference in mind, we come back to intersectionality, and I'd like to remind us of two things. One is that there is a reason that we say race, class, and gender, and that is not just accidental or because people are lazy, it is because it was Black feminists who made that word. So it's not surprising that the words we use reflect the theoretical categories they created in order to narrate their own experience into the public domain. And while there is a lot of focus, rightly so, I think, on Kimberly Crenshaw, Bell Hooks, Patricia Hill Collins. So the person I want to mention is Polly Murray, a queer woman, Black, not necessarily well known, except in legal circles or places where people do Black history. But her work really is foundational for what became intersectionality. In particular, in Jane Crow and the Law, she argued that, look, there is an effort to give a civil rights law which will give protection to African-American men. And then in an effort to discredit that, because whoever heard that women should get rights, as a joke, women were added to the civil rights law. It was assumed that, yeah, it's so obvious women shouldn't have rights. If we put it in, it'll fail. And there was some hesitancy, including in the Black community, that, okay, if you do this, you're diluting our issue.
And what Polly Murray said was,
look, when you get discriminated against in the labor market, you don't know whether the guy is doing this because you're a woman or because you're colored. Even if you can intuit he's doing this because of your race, all he has to do is to say, no, her race has nothing to do with it. I did this because she's a woman.
so part of what Murray was pointing out was
That if the law did not include women, even if the discrimination was taking place because of race, you couldn't prove it. So the question of intersectionality from its outset was always not about personal identity or psychic identity alone. It was about social visibility, social structures, the rules, legal and informal, that allow people to get away with bad behavior or punish some people for being non-normative in approved or disapproved labor market. So
Murray was the reason why
she insisted, look, we need to make sure women are included. Even if they're doing it for the wrong reasons, if you don't include women, then 50% of the Black population will be left out, let alone the fact that 50% most population will be left out. So I really want to note that this way of thinking of intersectionality both gives us an insight into gender, but also gives us an insight into the kind of legacy Drew was drawing on when she insisted that we have to rethink difference in socio-historical, structural, concrete ways, which is a kind of legacy where you really cannot, in very genuine ways, imagine that you could possibly have liberation. This is why it's, liberating economics, if a portion of the population is left out. And indeed, as feminists, we actually owe a deep debt to intersectionality. So it is not that we had women's rights first and then intersectionality came. It is that intersectionality was the leading edge of ensuring that we got civil rights in the United States. And I think that this is a lesson for people all over the world, and one that is very much in Drew's spirit. So with that in mind, I just want to note finally that Drew, in querying the paradox of caring labor, was always interested in diverse forms of provisioning care, private sector, household, unpaid labor, and the state. So I think we do have time. I think we have about 15 minutes for Q&A, after which Serap will join us.
For Dr. Hopkins, the question is, I was really interested in the way that you talked about how ideology can create the choices and the rules that people have access to. How, the mythology-wise, do you go about looking at the economic impacts of the ideology? What are some examples of impacts that you might be more direct or more indirect?
I think one of the things is that part of what recognizing the complexity of the structure means that, you know, sort of if you take that idea of the cult of domesticity, part of that recognition is the cult of domesticity is a unique, it's unique to a particular place, time, and class, and other categories that are relevant to that. And so, you know, part of what understanding the structure is you have to look at a particular structure. There's no way you can get at some kind of a universalist impact. You have to take a specific ideology in a specific location at a specific time and analyze the impact, right? And I think that that's sort of part of the lesson that I have come to from looking at all of these things. And this is reflected in what I think of my location as being an intersection of feminist radical institutionalism and non-essentialist Marxism. But the non-essentialist Marxism is part of what you are taking a specific phenomenon that you are analyzing. So, and then you choose a place to start, but you recognize that all knowledge is partial and whatever story you're telling is incomplete. The idea that, and my students will recognize this as being a major conflict that I have with my neoclassical colleagues, is this idea of trying to find a sort of universal relationship there. And I think part of that is that you can't find a kind of empirical, well, not empirical, you're not going to be able to find an econometric style measure of it, because any kind of measure like that is going to be incomplete. And the argument I was having with my neoclassical colleagues is about saying that, you know, if we cannot look at measures about income without disaggregating it and unpacking it, because we don't really have any idea what. If we look at average GDP per capita, it's meaningless. Let's look at the average GDP per capita in the US and Mexico. That really doesn't tell us anything. You need to dig deeper. You need to get to more disaggregated things. And so that a way in which you can identify the relationship between ideology and its impact on the economy is to start with a particular location and look at that analysis to get there.
Thanks, Barbara. The next question is for me, and I can finally read my chat again. The question is, although context changes how gender and labor operate, do you find some commonalities across multiple different milieus? To what structure would you attribute those similarities? This is a very difficult question for two reasons. One has to do with the question of scale in terms of geographic region or cultural region, right? Like, what is the scale on which I decide I'm talking about gender relations? Do I take the nation state for granted? So I'll talk about gender relations in India. But now this is not just a data point question, it's actually a political and ideological question. There is an investment by nationalist movements in India to claim that there is a single universal cultural norm that applies to the entire country. And historians show that this is a back reading, that this is not actually, that there's very little evidence that the contemporary geographic boundaries of what is called India were actually meaningful back for accept as back formations, historical. So one of the first questions we want to think about is scale. So when you want to say is similarities, I would like to know the scale on which you're talking about similarity. I think there are biological similarities, lactation. I think that's a good one. But on the other hand, there is not cultural similarity on lactation, the extent to which it is far less comfort in the United States to see women lactating in public or to breastfeed their children is one thing, and it has very severe labor implications. Another thing that's different is how long people breastfeed their children. There is sometimes in some communities I have seen in the US, certain anxiety about breastfeeding the children past a certain point, even though it's much more common to do that in other parts of the world and so on. So there you go, there is a similarity. The similarity is that in most parts of the world, we are mammals and it is women and not men who breastfeed. But on the other hand, what it actually means in terms of socio-cultural institutional forms is very different. So if you want to ask me, where do I attribute the commonality? I can see commonalities, but that is, the question is, at what scale and for what political import? So a story I like to tell is, there is the story of the Caliph who asked his vizier, this is actually an Akbar Babur story, I think, but I might be misattributing. This story is told in many cultures. That, you know, king is a learned man, but he's busy. So he asks, please give me a history of the world. And so he gets back 15 volumes. Then he tells the vizier, look, I'm very busy man, too much, give me a little less. This is a bit like why every policy brief has a cover page, by the way. Every feminist economist knows that. But I'll do that. Come down to 2 volumes. Look, I'm really busy and, you know, I want to sound wise. I have to read this between tonight and tomorrow. Give me something universal. And so this is fine, no problem. He gives him a little slip. And it says, they were born, they lived, they died. So the question really is not whether there are commonalities. The question is, what is the scale on which the commonality makes sense to you? So that is one part of it. I think that if the scale is about provisioning, resource distribution, labor distribution, it's not clear to me that an abstract universal scale makes sense, because we do have historic evidence of very diverse range of ways in which societies have engaged in provisioning. Access to land, access to property, control of environment, mechanisms of providing for people at different phases and stages of their lives. So we have a very wide range of it, and both men and women and third genders and fourth, fifth, sixth genders have done it. So that is one thing. But here is the second thing. There is a feeling of universality, and I want to talk about this. One thing we have to confront is that to the extent that capitalism became a global system, the institutions, structures, ideologies, and cultures that started following it in the wake of colonial capital started universalizing. So I do think there is commonalities, but it's going to be, to my mind, the nuclearization of the family is not a sign that the nuclear family is universal. The nuclearization of the family is a sign that the project of development universalized the urban factory work form. So it's really a causation question and not just a commonality question that you're asking. So I think both those things are at play. If you're looking for a commonality that exceeds space and time and history, you can get it. It's kind of low. if you're looking for commonalities, I actually think there are some very important historical and useful ones. And they're useful because when you look at them as commonalities, you can start seeing them as common consequences of common structures, following the institutionalist and Marxist intuition, as opposed to the tendency to view them as common causes that show some universal gender. So even if you see commonality, you might actually be seeing common causation.
If I can jump in here, I want to highlight something Charu has said here, which is that idea of turning on its head, you know, the what causes things. In the diagram that I had, I realized as soon as I started explaining it that I really should have arrows going from every single oval to every other oval, because you have these feedbacks and this idea about also sort of recognizing, you know, where did the ideology come from, and then how did the ideology affect there. It's a circular thing, and it's always going to be a circular thing. That, you know, there's always going to be a chicken egg problem, right? That which came first, and you have these, you know, which is why you choose in the methodology, you choose a starting point, yeah, and then you go from there. But it's you choose something based on a kind of knowledge that you're trying to create, not based on the idea that there's a single truth.
Here is the thing though, Barbara, this is evolutionary biologists do this all the time. Ecologists do this all the time. Nobody accuses them of being like, how dare you start with the dinosaurs, right? I mean, nobody does that, right? There is an understanding that when you are engaging in an analysis that is about historical causation, you have to have a historical starting point, right? So the way in which we get nervous with even far shorter timescales as human beings about this, when we perfectly understand it when it comes to sort of geological timescales that are at stake in geology, biology, and all, it's sort of interesting that it's not because we don't know how to understand it. It's because there is some deeper stake about rethinking causality that might be difficult for people to handle.
Well, I just mean that, you know, if you're trained as an economist, there's a lot of deconstructing that is required in order to
yeah. On that word deconstruction, Serap is in the waiting room, and I want to be mindful of time. It is so early in the morning in Europe. So before I turn it over, I just want to thank this sort of question of multiple arrows and multiple causation, because of course, in the Association for Economic and Social Analysis, we call this over-determination, multiple over-determined, where there is, and it's not that there is no causality and anything goes, it is that there is contingent causality that is situationally dependent. And given that Drew herself was really invested in this way of thinking of social reproduction, and she indeed took a very active role, especially since she joined the Association for Economic and Social Analysis. Actually, I believe at the invitation of another scholar we have lost, Julie Graham, who I also miss. I would like to invite Serap Kayatekin, my dear friend, my ex-roommate from grad school and the current president of the Association for Economic and Social Analysis. Serap.
Thank you, Charu. Good morning from Greece. It's very early in the morning. It feels so strange and out of place to be talking about Drew. It is so hard to accept that she has passed and to be doing this at the early hours of this what promises to be a beautiful day seems very incongruent. I will not talk about Drew's accomplished scholarship here. I think that has been discussed already in several different fora. I think it goes largely uncontested that her work bears great significance to the fields, she was in. I just want to talk to you about how she was as a friend and a comrade. Drew joined our Association for Economic and Social Analysis in 2008. Just as a background information there, just one tiny bit. We are the association, we are the organization that produces the journal Rethinking Marxism. And the association has been there longer than the journal itself. We are more than 40 years in existence. So let me give a shout out to Suzanne Bergeron here. I want to thank her in public for introducing Drew to our organization, because she did, in fact, introduce an amazing person. I can say that Drew's presence in ASA was almost instantly felt. Her seemingly endless energy, willingness, and effectiveness to connect with others were instantly noticeable. Her ability to organize events was something to behold. We are indebted to her for many different reasons, but also for organizing our summer retreats, which are extremely important, for the group to sustain itself. In 2013, she joined the editorial board of RM, Rethinking Marxism, where she continued to work with her unfathomable sources of energy. She volunteered for article reviews. She volunteered to join tasks such as committee work, which we all know, I guess, in different ways, are things that we either resist or find other excuses to stay away from. So in these ways as well, she has been absolutely central to the journal, not just the organization. I want to tell you also that I became the co-editor of the journal. At the same time, it turns out Drew joined the editorial board. And I consider myself very lucky for this, because in addition to all the work she did visibly and invisibly, Drew was an enormous source of strength for me and my co-editor at the time, Marcus Green. Anyone who has worked as an editor will know that it is not an easy position. Getting criticism, and sometimes very hard criticism, comes with the territory. And on a number of such occasions, Drew wrote to us telling us what a great job we were doing, to me and Marcus, and that was priceless. I loved being here in her company. She was warm, had a wonderful sense of humor, always worked from a place of love and humility. I am 65 years old, and Drew was just a few years older than me. Along with another friend who was a member of the editorial board, Enid Arvidsson, we used to tease each other that we all belonged in the club of 60+ women, a very small minority. The next group in age is considerably younger than us, about by 15 years. In the time I knew her, Drew, for me, was someone who lived in defiance of stereotypes about women and about age. I think she lived her life with more intense levels of passion and hope than people, or many people, much younger than her. Once, when I asked her how she was doing all the things that she was able to, she told me, Serap, this is all the life I have, meaning I don't have a private life. This is all I do. While I understood the absence that she felt in her life, I disagreed secretly with how she characterized her life, because it was so full, so rich, so engaged, and so full of love. I am not a believer, and I don't believe in an afterlife. But the image of Drew free from pain is the only thing I find some solace in. And those of you who know her closely will know also that she was living with chronic and very intense, excruciating pain for a number of years. It still didn't stop her. So for a while, I'll just hang on to this image of Drew free from pain. Rest in peace, Drew. I will always remember you. I will always remember your bright red hair, bright red lipstick, colorful scarves, the twinkle in your eyes, the smile on your face, and the glass of wine in your hand, and open arms for company. Thank you.
Please sit up. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I don't know what more to say. It's so, I miss her. Anyway, this was a moving testimony to end us. We will meet once more. It will never be a final goodbye to Drew. But we do have a March 1 seminar. One more moment to carry forward, and we will keep doing that. I think we should end the talks here. Students in my class, I'll come down and we can talk about work. But otherwise, everybody else, and especially our guest speakers, Barbara. Thank you. Bye, everyone. I'm just very emotional. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you also for organizing us all to do this and quickly pivoting to honor Drew. It's been particularly moving to all of us, I'm sure.
Thanks, Barbara. Unless anybody has something to say before we shut this Zoom down, you can put it in the chat to Sophie. Otherwise, I'm going to end. It is 10 minutes to 8 over here. All right. Bye, everyone.